Even if we're waiting for a couple more people to arrive, it's really great that we've got a range of different people from outside the school, and one of the key people who's been helping our research from the start is Alex Dunning from the Ragged University. This is a little promo for some of the Ragged events which are coming up tonight. But maybe you can say a few words, Alex, about what's coming up in March, the new season of Ragged events.
So, firstly, all the Ragged University events are free and open to everybody. They're informal, so you can come and put your feet up, grab a glass of something and enjoy socialising through learning. Tonight we've got Leon Pass, who's a psychologist, and he's going to be talking about mood hacking and methods of managing our mood in psychology. These are going to be discussions throughout the year, where he hopes that people will walk away with an understanding of basic concepts that will be helpful in people's lives. There's going to be a whole series of events rolling out through the year, and everybody's welcome to share what they're passionate about. So, yeah, please do get in touch if that's of interest.
So what time are you meeting tonight then? It's not on the slide.
It's 6:30 at Cabaret Voltaire. I put on some food, and everybody's welcome to bring an item and put it on the table if they like, no obligation. If you're ever interested in the details, go to raggeduniversity.co.uk and all the details are always on the front page.
So this was the little email which went around, and it was quite difficult to think of an aspect of the research that you can cover inside of a short seminar session. And I was conscious that as the time was getting closer, that different people who had contacted had confirmed they were attending. So I'm delighted as well that Police Scotland is here, and they managed to publish their corporate parenting plan before we have. So it's great that we can learn some lessons, and that sharing of knowledge between the corporate parents is something which is really important. So the little poster might be a bit confusing because there's a whole lot of things crammed into it. And I was just, even when I met Alex beforehand, half an hour before, trying to just cut down the number of slides because I was conscious that we've got a mixed range of people. I didn't want to just talk about research design. I wanted it to be a dynamic discussion and maximize the range of people, the insights that you're looking from the people here. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the genesis, the origin of the research area, a bit of the background on the topic, on the culture that I'm exploring, and then, so in a sense, that's setting up a problem area and then a potential solution to that problem would maybe be the best way of describing it. And then I want to leave enough time at the end to have a discussion with the people who are around. This is one of the first quotes that I like to remind myself of as well. I think it's an important part of the exploration of the research. You can discover more about a person in an hour of play than can in a year of conversation. And it's difficult to find attribution of where it originated, but I think it brings together a lot of the energy and ethos of the research approach. So I wanted to give a quick background introduction, talk briefly about the research design, the importance of teaching for the research for me, studying part-time or working full-time at the university. I'm sure other people who've been doing that will understand the importance of bringing the two areas together. And for me, there's been a really great connection between what I would describe as the research-led teaching and also teaching-led research. There's a nice connection between the two. Then I wanted to spend a bit of time just talking around Jean Rouch's approach, shared anthropology, and some of the early exploratory studies which I've been doing inside the university with some of the students, and then leave a bit of time, like I said, for questions at the end and talk about future direction of the research outside the university. So essentially, when I'm talking about Jean Rouch, I'm thinking about not reverse engineering his approach, his method, but about ingesting it and taking inspiration from it and seeing what I can learn from the insights that the rich methodological process that here developed through play and through a range of different inspiration. So I'll just read the first part here to remind me of something important. By taking inspiration from Jean Rouch and other inclusive approaches, the aim is to generate new insights into the real perceived barriers for participation in higher education among care leaders and those from widening participation backgrounds, which is more the demographic of the module that I'm teaching. So the second part of that then is to support sustainable change. There is a change dimension to the research to inform policy that can help corporate parents adopt to better support people to navigate complex power structures on the next step of their journeys. So key themes would be around identity, around otherness, the empowerment of the people involved. So also I would describe it as an emancipation of the people involved, representation, core to that is empathy, ideas about family, and corporate versus normal parenting. I'm conscious that perhaps people may have not heard of some of the phrases around care experience and corporate parenting, which I'll get to, but I'll get the kind of blueprint of the research slide out of the way, which was really start. I guess the text is a bit small, sorry for people over there, but essentially, I think a nice analogy for thinking about research design would be to think of a blueprint of a building, of a house. You set the philosophical foundations, and then you build out from there. So the basic foundations for me are based on a constructivist values, this idea that the nature of reality is multifaceted, that we can experience reality from multiple perspectives, and by that nature it's dynamic. That the way in which we come to know aspects of the people working would be interpretivist. So we can contrast that with more traditional positivist dimensions of science, of natural science-based research. So when it comes to contrast to the positivist domain, interpretivism is much more about this idea of that there's going to be multiple agents involved, and the research strategy is building up from that idea. The research questions, I presented that problem area there. The research questions related essentially to an investigation of shared anthropology. So a kind of recovery of Jean Rouch's approach, and then having a look how the technology of today, lens-based digital media today, could influence each aspect of that approach. And then also then about the human dimension, how useful it could be for corporate parents for moving forward, that they can usefully apply knowledge which is gained from this approach. The research strategy I was describing as participatory action research. So if you were thinking about different models of research design, then you would have pure research, which is exploring something, creating new knowledge within itself. And then you would have applied research, but really the emphasis here is about action and change, that I want to be doing that by involving the people that I'm working with at each stage. Complementary to that is the idea that it's grounded, so rather than imposing a theoretical model on to people, I'm starting with the data which is existing and building out from that with a qualitative strategy. And shared anthropology is very compatible to that kind of model. So the specific methods, I've started with some sequential interview, narrative-based interviews. When we're exploring some technology, we're hijacking some of the HDI approaches to talk aloud. And I also wanted to create an autoethnographic account as I'm going. So I'm documenting the process using some of the digital media which is being explored. So essentially there's three lenses that we can come to understand the research design through, which are the sociological, the people involved in the study, methodological, the methods employed, the people, the form of engagement, and the technological aspect, the specifics of the technology and the role that plays. So for me, the sociological is a misrepresented and underrepresented group of young people in Scottish higher education, young people who are care experienced, as well as some of our widening participation students. The methodological part is a recovery of the participatory aspects of Jean Rouche's creative praxis, which I'm going to delve into over a few slides. And then the technological part is having a look at how the affordances of digital media can build out on aspects of shared anthropology. And one of the key parts here of this very design is that young people are involved not just in the acquisition of data, but in the coding stages and the sharing and the distribution of that data, the ownership of it afterwards. So I thought I'd just start by digging in a little bit more deeply into this, into the sociological area around young people who are care experienced, starting off with a definition here. So we had some corporate parenting training, which Peter told me, who's our official, what's your official role these days now?
Well,
Corporate parent. Lead.
I chair the corporate parenting group.
Yeah. Arranged some training from Care Scotland who came in, so I pulled some of the latest data from their slides to keep this up to date. So care experience essentially means, is used to describe a person who's been looked after by the state. There's a few ways that can happen. In Scotland, we're talking about less than 1% of the population who are care experienced. So something like 15,000 young people. So not a huge amount of the population if we look at it as a starting point. The types of care that people can go into range is varied. So we see in Scotland roughly is 35% of young people who are in foster care from that less than 1% of the population. 10% residential, so living in a children's unit or house. Significant chunk, 28% in kinship care, so living with friends or a relative. 25% at home, so living with parents, but the involvement from social services. And 2% is other, so it could be with a different community. So you can see foster and kinship represent the largest space there. The important part of when I was talking about misrepresented and underrepresented, then there is some stigma around this label. And the Who Cares highlights a nice way of understanding this with this idea of needs, not deeds. So they say the reason for people going into care is in 90% of cases a need of care and protection as opposed to any deed or offence that they may have committed themselves. From that then is the first question for you to make sure everyone stays awake when I'm talking about research design. What percentage of 19-year-old care leavers enter higher education do you think in Scotland? Pete's not allowed to answer.
15.
15%?
Just a guess. Yeah. 0.
0%.
One.
Somewhere in that range, so we've got a range. So maybe we can say how many, most people will probably appreciate working in university that we're comparing about 40% of young people from the rest of the population who are not care experienced go to university. The Scottish government quotes figures, the latest figures, something around 5%. However, if you dig a bit deeper into that, and Pete's been looking at this data more carefully and passed on their plan for me, you realise that there's some flaws in that data, or it's not as black and white as it may seem, like many statistical figures, I guess. But essentially they were taking that data from people when they were leaving school at the stage where they were saying where they're going next, what kind of positive destination maybe people are going into. So in actuality, the number could be a lot less. And for us, we know that people self-declaring in Edinburgh Napier University is less than 1%. So if we've got an underrepresentation in higher education, then we have a scarily bent overrepresentation in prison and homeless populations. So here we can see that 33% of young people in prison and 31% of adult prisoners self-report as having previously been in care from the Scottish Prison Services. Again, the data probably doesn't show the full extent, so it's estimated, you can see from corporate parenting plan from Scotland that figure is probably higher than that. And then 30%, again, probably plus, of homeless people have experienced the care system. So starting off with an area where there's a need, not a deed, the corporate parenting structure is clearly there's plenty of room for improvement in looking after the young people who are in this need, who face a duty of care by the government. I'm just going to play a short clip from Lem Sisay's video. This is his TED Talk, so he's a playwright and also an actor, and he talks very openly about his care experience. And there's an important part here which leads on to the next part of the discussion, which I'm just going to play a small clip from his TED Talk. I just need to check the sound. I think it's going to come out with the TV. Yeah. Oh.
It seems that writers know that the child outside of family reflects on what family truly is more than what it promotes itself to be. That is, they also use extraordinary skills to deal with extraordinary situations on a daily basis. How have we not made the connection? And why have we not made the connection between, how has that happened between these incredible characters of popular culture and religions and the fostered, adopted or orphaned child in our midst? It's not our pity that they need, it's our respect.
And I think that segues quite nicely into this idea of labels being for jars, not people. I think that represents quite nicely this post-positivist domain that the research is fitting in too. First time I came across that word was from a rapid talk, and it was something which really resonated. So if we dig a bit deeper into care leaver identity, when I was doing my teaching certificate at Edinburgh Napier, it was the first time I came across the term, and I was working with George Wilson, who at the time was a named person for care experience people at the university. And we created, it was the blended online course, and we were exploring how potential uses of online technology could be useful for hard to reach learners. And we looked at it more deeply at young people who were care experienced. So the research problem around aiming to generate new insights for the real and perceived barriers for participation in higher education among care leaders and people from wider participation backgrounds by including their perspective in policy making is my aim. The existing data, so this is someone who we interviewed during that postgrad teaching certificate. She was telling us that in her study, she was actually the first recipient of the Lem Sisay PhD scholarship grant. She was looking at some of the transitional challenges that young people face entering higher education when coming from care. And she was saying that one of the key themes is around corporate versus normal parenting, which is what I want there to be a little bit of discussion around at the end of the session today. So that was the kind of starting point for my grounded approach for talking to other people. And another interesting thing which came out of the data element was this idea that teachers are cited. I looked after young people as the most influential and consistent in their lives, which I think is another important point. So in the modules that I've been teaching a design thinking module. My postgrad degree was in product design and service design. And so I was applying aspects of shared anthropology through a prism of service design. And that involved working with students, some of the third-year students who were direct entrant onto our program in the university, who faced different challenges for assimilating into a different environment, and could also be the first from their family to be going to university. So they were quite familiar with some of the ideas around care experience. And this is some of the campaigns that they produced at the end of that module. So this one I especially liked. This is just a picture of a paramedic on the side, and it's about challenging the negative stigma around care experience. It says, this person saves lives, this person has dedicated their life to helping people, this person was told that it would never amount to anything, this person was in care until they were 18. Help care leavers to find their way into higher education. Maybe one day they would help you. And the other project, we worked with Katrina Castle, and students produced a touch-activated poster using digital ink, where there was sound recorded into the poster, so they were capturing some of the ideas that challenge some of the stereotypes around the labeling of care experienced young people. So transitioning into the methods section of the part, digging a little bit deeper into shared anthropology, this quote becomes important. Whatever you do for me, but without me, you do against me. So it's quite an extreme statement, but we can see that how important that would be, how important it is to include the young people in the design of policy, which is in essentially being created for them. And this was something which was reflected very deeply into the DNA of shared anthropology. So I'm going to give a quick overview of Jean Rouche's approach and then show how I was taking inspiration from that while working with students in the early stages of the PhD. So I should say as well, the PhD is part-time, and I've just transitioned into the second year, so it's an early stage. And my idea was to work with Edinburgh Napier students to begin with, learn lessons about the approach, working with the students, and then take that knowledge outside and start working with some outside organizations. So just completing the module is just wrapping up now for Easter, so it's interesting to have the reflections on that. So Jean Rouche himself described himself as a poet and an engineer. There's something interesting about the science and the art coming together, which I think is very well represented in digital media and interaction design. Quite a French juxtaposition, one that continues to fascinate me since discovering about him. And I came across Jean Rouche originally at a symposium during the film festival when I was talking to Dr. Andrew Irvine of the Granada Center for Visual Anthropology, and I was explaining the energy of the PhD, and he said you should check out some of the films of Jean Rouche and some of the research they were doing there around contemporary visual ethnographic approaches. So if we have a very quick look at some of the influences of Jean Rouche himself, he acknowledges the influences from fictional uses of documentary filmmaking. So we see Robert Flaherty's influence, Soviet futurist Dziga Vertov, and the French writer André Breton's Surrealist Manifesto. So quite a mixture of different things which are going on there. And you could spend the whole lecture just unpicking aspects of these, which are quite fascinating. But the idea then being that from Dziga Vertov's perspective, that the technology, the camera had some agency in investigations, which is what Jean Rouche was interested in, was the role the camera played. So camera over pen. And then the uses of fiction, which come across in some of the early documentary films, where they realized that it was more, you got a closer representation of a culture by including some fictional recreations. And then the Surrealist Manifesto around the idea that there is a lot going on underneath the surface of things, and how do we go about potentially eliciting the more hidden aspects of some of the complexities of studying social phenomena. So shared anthropology is an approach, a creative approach to engaging with people, which developed out of Rouche's fieldwork in West Africa in the 1950s. So he was playing surrealist-inspired games with his informants. The approach resulted in a new genre which became known as ethnographic fiction or ethnofiction. So he was hired by the French state. He was operating as doing more traditional ethnographic work there. But at the same time, he was exploring new ways of working with people. And I think it's important to acknowledge the time period and the way that ethnographic research was being conducted. There was very much an idea of them and us. And he was challenging a lot of those ideas through his approach. And then later on in his own manifesto, this is, I think, a nice quote which sums up some of the work, which says, "This type of participatory research, as idealistic as it may seem, appears to me to be the only morally and scientifically feasible anthropological attitude today. Quite a bold statement, but we start unpicking some aspects of shared anthropology. It becomes very interesting to see some parallels that we recognize today in participatory action research, design, or any co-design projects which involve working with people. So at the heart of shared anthropology was this idea of participation in each stage, which we can see in action research. And then perhaps more of a unique aspect of his research approach was the use of fiction through projected improvisation. So he would be working with people who were navigating from the rural areas into these townships, into the colonial towns from in West Africa. And he was using a camera in that experience. And rather than just filming people like an interview, he was using the camera to provoke a different kind of reaction. And importantly, the camera had moved from being in a purely observational mode into a more participatory mode through playful uses of the technology. And so the people involved were essentially playing a role-played version of themselves, but in the improvisation and in the fictional representations of themselves, it was tapping into a deeper aspect of their worldview through the approach. And then the little figure and then the larger one represents that through this reflexivity, through the participation in the experience, that there was a change which occurred. At the reflexivity, the idea being that it's not just a reflective practice, but one which also you notice change which is occurring. To give you a quick overview of the way that the process worked, I'll go through these next slides and I'll talk a little bit more about the ethnographic approach that he was using. So collaborators are actively involved at each stage of the data gathering process, acknowledges and celebrates the presence of him as the researcher in the experience, and contributes to culture through teaching and sharing of knowledge for the participants who were involved. So the young people involved, he was using a 16mm film camera, which I was saying at the time had become just small enough to handhold, but you couldn't capture sound at the same time. So he would film these short fictional ethnographic fiction films. There would be a time where the film had to get processed, and then he would invite the participants back for a screening. And it was during the screening then that you can imagine a parallel to the data coding of an interview where it might be a solo experience, but the people were involved in seeing how they were represented at that stage, even to the fact where they were adding a soundtrack to the production because of the nature of the silent film. And then the sharing of that initially was between the people in the culture, and the next films which were created were often elicited through a conversation with the people in the culture, what they were interested in. So this idea of that I highlighted before, you can learn more about a person through an hour of play. I just hacked that a little bit, this idea that you can also understand more about technology in an hour of play. And this brings me up into working with some digital technology. So reimagine the way that Bruce's 16mm camera has evolved. Then we've got important digital revolution which occurred, meaning there was more of a democratization of camera technology. For him, he was still, although the camera was handheld, it was still only him using and operating the camera. Today, of course, we all have these cameras in our pockets, so we can make a big jump from 16mm to video to the digital cameras in our pockets. And importantly, with these cameras, they are also married with a microprocessor and the internet. So not just a taking device, but a device which can be used for sharing content with a digital on a global stage. Also, we are interacting with the content afterwards. It's not just passively receiving it like screens may have been the case in the past. So we can see that the digital aspect, the digital media aspect, starts to potentially reshape each stage of the very quick introduction I gave you there to shared anthropology, the acquisition of the data, the coding of the data, and the sharing of that outside of the experience. So importantly, involving the people at each stage. So part of my research question was, how is digital altering that? And I started some of the first experiments pretty much by staying true to John Rush's approach, trying to spend a lot of time almost reverse engineering shared anthropology. And I realized that became slightly less true to the spirit of what he was talking about. And at the end of the digging into literature and working with students, I realized that for Rush, the shared anthropology was more about a way of operating as opposed to something that can be theorized as a method, a form of engagement and an ethos for engaging and connecting with people. So the digital technology is what I wanted to spend just the last 5 or 10 minutes talking a bit about. So I mentioned there some of the potential of the humble smartphone, but of course we also have lots of other type of technology. And I think if we are going with that idea that the camera evolved from film camera into a digital camera, into married with a microprocessor we're carrying around in our pockets. On the other side, that's still a physical camera. From about the 90s onwards, we also have completely virtual cameras, which were pioneered in cinema. We think of films like The Matrix or David Fincher's movie, Fight Club and Panic Room, where there's a completely CG environment and he can basically the film director can choose where the camera moves in that environment. So it opens up other really interesting possibilities of representation and also who is involved in recording of experiences. So if we retrace our way back to the idea that there are multiple views of reality, how can the technology enable us to see or engage with multiple views on that reality? Navigating this new terrain of technology is obviously challenging, but also really interesting. And around the same time that I was working with some students last year, I came across a book from the MIT Media Lab called Whiplash, How to Survive or Fast the Future. And essentially it's a manifesto from the Media Lab. And they are talking about the essence of the book really is that technology, even the mobile phone in our pocket, has, as soon as you marry the camera with a microprocessor, it starts to get tagged with Moore's law. So there's a change which is happening so fast that the technology supersedes our capacity to really understand it. So it was interesting for me that by using shared anthropology, you could also generate new insights to the digital media that we're working with. So I'm going to just give a couple of examples of projects which the students have been working on. So just a very quick overview of the module. So the demographic on the module on design thinking and doing is primarily students who have come from college. We do have some European students there as well from Erasmus programs. And they were giving a challenge to explore aspects of university policy, which especially were around the idea of improving transitions into university for students at that entry point. We know that there's challenges around feeling a sense of belonging, also around academic achievement as well. So they were involved in the assessment design to dig a bit deeper in these themes. So they constructed or they gathered data using traditional approaches. We did interviews and focus groups. And then we created what's called an empathy map, essentially a character diamond from the research data. And then we started exploring what a digital version of shared anthropology might look like. So the remit was in essence about creativity and about play, about feeling comfortable by failing. And the little camera which is attached to the iPad, I'm going to demonstrate to you in a minute, captures sculptural data, Z-depth data, as well as the RGB data from a camera. So if anyone's used the Microsoft Kinect, which captures depth data, it's a camera which is capable of doing that. And what you end up with is a sculptural photograph, which is very interesting. This little video clip is with students exploring how GoPro cameras and mobile phones might be used in a recreation of shared anthropology experience. So the guy behind is actually holding a little GoPro camera, and these students were actually on exchange from France. And what they wanted to look at was how we can improve the canteen experience. They were saying the food in the canteen is rubbish. And so they were coming up with some different scenarios of like a food truck, and they were using the ethnofiction session to play out what a customer, the touch point between the service user and the service provider. And they were playing with the cameras in an interesting way. Again, I didn't tell them how to use the cameras. They were just given the cameras, and through kind of playful exploration, they were role-playing aspects of that. That resulted in, I'll pass around, so some really interesting forms of video, but also then we created a sculptural photograph of a particular experience, which I'll pass around. And so this is essentially, if anyone knows anything about forum theatre, or it's a tableau, it's a frozen moment. And in forum theatre, you would invite people to create what's called a statue, and that would be a key moment that others in the group can come to understand. So essentially, we've created a digital version of that. I'll just pass it around on the iPad. And this little video is of the students then taking that sculptural photograph of that particular moment inside of Brush using HTC Vive. And so this is, if we go back to the shared anthropology approach, there's the acquisition of data using digital cameras, and then the decoding of the data. So rather than a screening, they're experiencing that particular moment that they created in virtual reality. And the way they used that technology, again, this was just explorative. They started drawing gaps of what the service experience would be like. So they started enhancing that frozen moment with what the vehicle which they'll be delivering their service would look like. So it was really interesting to see how the digital technology offered a new kind of perspective. With that sculptural photograph, you could essentially occupy the view of the different people involved in the experience. So there was an interesting combination of application of the technology for seeing a bit more the perspective of another in an experience. I'm conscious that kind of running a little bit short on time. Another thing they were looking at was how the multiple feeds from the cameras could be put together and shared with an audience, where there's a bit of software called Echo Studio, and it lets you click on a video and you can shift perspective between the different people, different feeds of video. So again, it was an interesting way of how digital media technology could be altering the shared anthropology experience, and also importantly, how that would involve people who were viewing the technology. So people outside of the experience you were sharing it with could interact in an ongoing experience. So just to finish off these slides before opening up a little bit for discussion, with the original ethnographic fiction from the outcome of shared anthropology, Rush originally intended it to be a dialogue between the researcher and the participants. With the digital ethnographic approach, or using digital media technology, what I realized is that there was a much more potential for connecting to an audience as well, as I was hinting out there. So there's interesting ideas of how the digital technology could involve a more democratic engagement with the people who are the research is for, but also a wider audience afterwards. I'll just finish up by showing or hinting towards some of the future work. So I realized at the end of the module that there was, rather than continuing to have this separation, two lines of inquiry inside the school and outside, there was a great opportunity. Again, this came about with conversations with Alex on this idea of a porous university, that we could be delivering experiences in the classroom and using technologies to push out into wider culture and involve people. So Google recently launched a Jamboard called, which is essentially a smart or improved version of the smart TV. So you can have be working with an agent out in the culture, delivering a lecture in the classroom, and have this through the digital technology, this really interesting engagement with outside cultures. And that was actually the really interesting turnaround which came out of the study with the students. Was at the beginning, we were thinking about, the coursework was around how to better support students to assimilate into the university environment. And at the end of it, in a nice kind of nod to Jean Rouch and their empowerment in the process, they came to this idea of how can the university better change to cater for their needs. I think I'll leave it there. I'll distribute the slides which have some useful links to talk more about corporate parenting, and also some of the references which are in the slides. I'm conscious that was kind of a lightning look at shared anthropology and also the topic around corporate parenting. But that would be really great if we could just capitalize a little bit on some of the people in the room. And maybe do you want to just tell us a little bit about how the corporate parenting plan is developing?
Yeah. Yes, so as John mentioned, my name is Peter Tormey. I work in the wider participation team. And I've developed the corporate parenting plan in partnership with Katrina Castle, who's the former head of wider participation, who's since left, and now Sandra Cairncross, who's the assistant principal for wider participation and community. So the plan is in the final stages and it'll be published by the end of this month. The deadline for publishing the plan is 1st of April, so we're going right up to the deadline. And currently only half the Scottish universities have published a plan, so I think we're not unique in that sense. And as John introduced, the corporate parenting plan is essentially sets the guidance from the university to consider young people who are care experienced more holistically. And I was interested in John's perspective on normal parenting, in quotation marks, versus corporate parenting. And as the similar kind of issues I've faced with the corporate parenting plan, this is the first corporate parenting plan which will be published annually and updated annually. And essentially the corporate parenting plan sets out the university's commitment to supporting care experienced individuals of all ages into university. Some of it, essentially it's built on some of the current practices we have, which are our admissions policies and some of the work that the wider participation team does. But we also have, as John presented, a specific data that I've looked at in the corporate parenting plan that we can kind of advance in the future. So John mentioned how individuals may be accommodated, so foster placement, looked after at home. And again, although grossly underrepresented in university, even within care experience data, individuals from specific backgrounds can be underrepresented as well. So for example, looked after at home as a population of individuals have the lowest expectations and positive estimations as any care experienced individual in Scotland, and looked after at home is a unique status to Scotland. So that's a part of the corporate parenting plan that I've looked at in this instance, but certainly going in the future as how we can identify and support individuals into university. And similarly, the period of time in care is something that we looked at. So we know that some individuals may be looked after for a week. That's as far as their data will go down to when students are applying. But equally, someone may be looked after for 3 weeks or up to 3 years as well. So there's all these different aspects of corporate parenting that on the surface, how universities and public institutions adopt will differ. But my inclination is to be more of a holistic approach and look at how universities and corporate parents can identify and provide equity to individuals. So it's a bit of a long-winded introduction, but
I think it's great, and I think that really brings home the idea of, if you can imagine what you would want for your own child, or what you liked about your own parenting, or you equally disliked, then that would be a good way of thinking about how we could create better services for the young people who we have a responsibility for as corporate parents. So this is, I didn't really set up too much about corporate parenting, especially spent a bit more time talking about it, but this initiative came about now because of changes to the Children and Young Persons Act 2014 in Scotland, and Section 9 on that highlights some key criteria which corporate parents should be following. And essentially they are pretty common sense things about spending time to make sure that we are looking after the interests of the young people who are in our essentially our corporate children, if you want to think about it in those ways. And this is a crucial date now that 3 years on, the Scottish Government wants to report back on the different agencies who are responsible as corporate parents. So these are broad, these are all the universities and colleges, hospitals, doctors, nurses, as well as the police who are here. And so there's an important discussion around how can we bring the young people's voice into the construction of the policy. So the project that I was working on within the university, I want to take out and work with some champions boards as well. So champions boards are groups of young care experienced people. So the idea being that I could essentially do a condensed version of the design thinking module with these students and invite them to participate in an experience where they have a voice on what corporate parenting looks like within institutions which are designed to cater for their needs. I don't know if you guys had any insights from your process, from how you, because you're working with Who Cares Scotland for the gathering.
Good afternoon, I'm Sarah Marshall, Sergeant with Police Scotland, with work with children and so it's for us really difficult to find out where to start with this. I think the key aspect of it was working with other corporate parents and trying to come up with a set of commitments that are going to help obviously care experience worthwhile, ones that you can add value to. So that was the key for us, was working with other corporate parents, in particular Who Cares Scotland. So we produced a plan, kind of version 1, sent it to Who Cares Scotland, and they said, needs a bit of work. And they gave us some pointers, key things about including young people in it, making it realistic, obviously working with partners too. So then we presented it again, and that's the published version. We're also looking to produce a child-friendly version, so that's very kind of corporate, and it's got a lot of jargon in it as well. It's really important that we produce one for the care experience so they actually know what it means and what we're doing for them. And again, we're involved in the Young Radical group through Who Cares Scotland to help us with the kind of design and the language, because language is really, really important. You touched on the report, because we have to do a report, so we're just in the process of finalising our 3-year report and the kind of progress that we've made in relation to being corporate parents and what our responsibilities are. So as you touched on earlier, it's just about your commitments to the care experience and what we can do to kind of help them, because the statistics for the outcomes are absolutely horrific. We actually got, a bit of a shock and a surprise when you look at the statistics for their outcomes, and the fact that, they will more likely to end up in prison, will not have good destinations, and also, death as well. And all that kind of thing for us really brought it home the importance to ensure that it's relevant and we can achieve and be proper corporate parents.
I was really interested in your presentation, Tom, and I'm not sure whether we've talked about this. I'm on Scott in Saki, but I made a film over a period of time, and one of the contributors to that film was a young woman called Ashley Cameron. And Ashley grew up in care. I didn't know this when we started making the film, but the film's available, and it's quite an interesting way of hearing the experience of someone who was involved in writing that. Ashley's now completing her degree at Stirling University, but we started filming with her when she was 10, and so it kind of follows the trajectory of her experience of the care experience, and when she was filmed in last year, one of the things that she said about the process of coming up with this legislation was that she'd gone to a meeting with Alex Salmon when she was involved as an ambassador for Who Cares Scotland when she was still a teenager, actually. And she said, "You're my dad." And we're all her dad. We're all the parents of that. And I thought that expressed that and that kind of personal story. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing about what you're doing is you're personalizing and finding ways of personalizing those experiences. But I think Ashley's a very important voice in this whole subject.
Actually, well, photography with Form 1 as well.
Sorry, Marion Kennedy, I'm in the photography department, and we've had two lots of volunteers working in Palm White Young Offenders Unit. Actually, in both instances, volunteering out with credit. 3 young women last year and 2 young women this year. Basically, within 5 college, teaching a course in photography, a short course in photography. But basically, you go classics of empowering them, an exchange of skills. And in both instances, the young lads, the first last year, they produced an exhibition about sort of objects that were important to them. Actually, I should have brought it along. This year, they produced a small booklet. Half a dozen of the lads, there was more in the class, but half a dozen lads produced still lives about their experience of friendship, of lack of friendship, and stuff like that. So it's been really, the lads have loved it, but my students have got so much out of it. It's quite incredible.
I know Paul Gray as well from the film. He's been doing some interviews, not specifically with care experience people, but prisoners there, and exploring how filmmaking practice can be used to communicate the stories. So even with using verbatim techniques, where you can protect the anonymity of the people who you're interviewing, but allow their voice to be heard using visual media.
We should just think, just briefly after that, one that in both instances, one of the lads last year and this year expressed interest in learning more about photography and actually enrolling in a program. They asked a lot of, just asked a lot of questions from my students about Napier, but there was no way. There didn't seem to be any sort of mechanism. I mean, obviously, my students couldn't engage in any depth of conversation about continuing to teach, but there didn't seem any mechanism to assist these young lads after they left. So no way of creating a how to be in touch. So as Simon was saying, when you leave, you might want to sort of, apply to everybody. I come to it up and down.
I think that's one of the big challenges for corporate parents. Because the ethos of corporate parents is that corporate parents link together, just as families link together, and it's yours through that often a transition period out of care or leaving school or applying for university or college that people can fall through the cracks and end up in negative kind of outcomes or negative circumstances. And there are initiatives ongoing, the universities in the region, in Edinburgh and the college, led by Napier University, creating a hub for success, which will link in with schools, colleges, universities to provide that support. But it's the big challenge of corporate parenting because the document itself, they can be standalone documents and they can look fantastic and have great aspirations. But in practice, I think that's when we'll really know how good a corporate parent or parent we are.
I think just add that Armistead Milcom, I think, said it very well. The American San Francisco pride writer Armistead Milcom, his autobiography is called My Logical Family. Not my biological family, my logical family. And how do you actually, how does that he's created that within the community, but how do you create that across corporate?
I'm really interested in the figures you gave, where people are living. My wife works in school for children who are excluded from most education, and one of the things she discovered is that you can be listed as being in foster care, but the truth is what you live in a studio flat with a wall, so you'll have children who are listed as being in foster care, but they're really just living by themselves in bedsitters. So if you look at that sort of figure of 35% people in foster care, that's the reality for a lot of those children.
And also, the individual looked after home, which is over quarters. They're under, although it's a supervision order, there's no social work involved, there's no counsel involved. So there's obviously something that led to people, a supervision order put in place, but yet there's no involvement, there's no intervention, and you're essentially just left to live under pseudo kind of supervision, which again seems implausible.
In formal conversations I had with Tom about good parenting, as well, were interesting to see how they map across. But Tom was talking about that your dad always would say to respect young people like they're adults, never talk down to people, to listen, to always be there. And I think in the interview with you, Pete, as well, when we were looking at some of the specifics of the policy and the energy which was coming out of Who Cares Scotland, they were talking quite a lot about love. And love can be pretty problematic if we're talking about corporate parenting. What does that mean? But actually, when you dig into what that really represents about listening with a willingness to change and respect, that those things start to make much more sense in terms of how corporate parents could adopt aspects of what it means to care for someone and let them know that they will be accepted and they'll be there. But yeah, there's definitely lots of work to do to improve those statistics. And my hope from part of this research is that I can use it to connect different people, perhaps which don't normally communicate or connect together, and crucially to involve the young people in the creation of different policies which are designed for them. Did there was any more questions about? Did you want to say?
Yeah, well, I'm very interested to hear people's experiences of working in and under corporate structures, because this is about relationships and non-instrumental relationships. So some of the thinking that John's stimulated in me has been to look at the natural history of families, our assumptions about families, and we foreground the positive, and we tend to not include in our mental impressions of families some of the devastating relationships that go on. Narcissistic relationships, opportunistic, exploitative, amongst siblings, among the parent-child relationship. But everybody in the structures will understand this. So talking with people in different sectors, often people find that they're hired into jobs that are caring, and then by following the very policies they're bound to follow, they're prevented from offering and extending that care. And the result is then the whole holistic human experience is reduced to an instrumental relationship. So I'm wondering about people's experiences of trying to do things, but being hindered by the structures, be it funding, be it resources. It can be.
I'd say training. To be honest with you, I'm often put in situations where I'm talking to a student and I don't have the training or the understanding to be able to advise them properly. And I won't do that because what I'm frightened of is advising them to do something which would be foolhardy or the wrong thing to do. So I will then give them over to professionals. To me, that's the only problem. And my job is, as an academic, is to help them with their academic career, not, it's not that I don't care or that I don't want to help them, it's that I feel that I'm not qualified to do so, and I would want to get that work in the way of that.
So I find it very interesting. I'm kind of from another area altogether, but I did work in educational psychology for a long time and had a special interest in care leavers and up to in Derbyshire. And in that area, because of the diffuse nature of the contacts that children might have had with lots of well-meaning and, some teachers who were perhaps better than others and social workers who were better than others and all the rest of it, they brought in a model of social pedagogy, which was to have a single designated person who would be with you, because that was, as you said right at the start, sometimes one teacher in a school who can be that person who's there for you, but only when you're in that school, and then you get changed again. And unfortunately, sometimes because of geography, it's not possible to actually maintain the school placement. But the idea of social pedagogy is that you've got this person for good or bad, because, parenting isn't always about good times, as you rightly said. It's also dealing with it and not being able to escape from that parent as well. Because I think that's one of the things kids in care learn, is that they can run away from things. They say, I don't like that social girl, or whatever, and avoid problems. But I'm just interested to know how you're going to do this. Using your technology, that's what I don't really get.
Okay. So for me, the shared anthropology, or my contribution to some of the complexities in that area, was about involving people in a process for understanding aspects of their particular needs. So shared anthropology, you can think of it as a type of action research. So if I want to work with now outside the university with some of the Care Experience Champions boards, these are young people who are currently not in tertiary education. And what I'm hoping is that by participating in a research project where essentially they are learning how to be social researchers, they realize that they have the skills to actively be engaged in university, and at the same time, through the process, generate insights which maybe are more nuanced, which might be difficult to unearth in other approaches. But yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges. I mean, we've talked in some of the steering groups to say at the moment, we are not, as program leader, I'm not told which students are care experienced. We have understanding in our particular area that most will probably come in direct entrant routes, but that's not all. So there's a lot of challenges around the labeling, and then also been talking with Marianne about different models. I think Strathclyde do this, where they have a named person within a school, but they're not students who you're teaching. So I'm in School of Computing, Marianne's in photography, that I could be corporate tech parent for photography students, and she could be for computing, something like that. But again, there's a lot of things to be worked out in that type of approach. And then, like you said, if perhaps the young person, how much say do they have in if they don't get on with that person? Is there another layer that they could go to? And I think that also brings up some interesting questions about institution as a corporate parent versus the individuals. So something which comes hinting out was that, there's going to be plenty of people who perhaps are not really interested in being a corporate parent, and what do they feel that they are being forced into a role? Or so I think there's a lot of complexity and there's not straightforward answers. And I think, but what is important is that we actively involve the people who we're designing policies for. We can learn lessons from other countries. I think if you look at the stats from Denmark, I've done different academic exchanges there, and I introduced my research to one of our partners in Copenhagen, and they didn't get even the definition. It was like, because every young person has a role model from very young age, and it's very consistent and joined up. And I think that's some of the energy which the Scottish Government's trying to do with get it right for every child. But yeah, there's challenges.
Kind of broader question in relation to that, in relation to policy specifically,
is that this is an idea seems to be being presented that there will be some kind of grassroots-led approach towards instituting policy. To what extent is that as open as it can be? How much do the people who are involved in the process feel involved in that final space? And also, in terms of the kind of the articulation, is that you just brought up, question, in the institutional aspect and the modelling of what this care provider is in that context. And my own personal experience of being young is I was sent to boarding school. So I had parents, but I had a boarding situation as well. And I was abused in that boarding situation. And that has subsequently had a lot of individual sort of characteristics in the way that I am within the context of institutions and the way that I am with issues around authority. So to what extent does this kind of research allow those kinds of issues to kind of be opened out and made more transparent and maybe feed up into this kind of structure moving forward? I mean, you talk about Denmark, they're so far ahead of us, and then you think about, one thinks about the kind of negative association with the Scottish Government's kind of provision of the guardianship scheme, which is seen as being somehow an imposition on that notion of the sacrosanct nature of the family. As a sociologist and anthropologist, my studies in the past have looked at areas around kind of what is family? Is family that nuclear model, parent, sibling, or is it actually much wider than that? And that's when it draws all these questions around community, in particular, these kind of, potentialities within the kind of broader structure. So, it's still far too early, but is there any kind of indication from this relationship that you're setting up with that group of peers in relation to the kind of overall structures of policy provision?
If you look at models, shared anthropology was happening in the 1950s. You can look at models since then. So I mentioned the foreign theatre or legislative theatre techniques, and we know that film from the Canadian Film Board, this very movement in film which happened after this as well, that storytelling, using art, using medium like film and photography can then be great ways of involving people and telling their own stories. So bringing those stories out and amplifying them and including them in discussions. So without being in the position I'm in, my hope is that the digital technology can further democratize aspects of that. And that's a bold thing to say, but we can see again, like models, like little hints with the Arab Spring, where the government was trying to restrict what was going on. And then the people on the ground suddenly realized that they could push through the firewalls because of the camera in their pocket. So there's really interesting little hints towards that. But I wouldn't be able to say more. My hope, ultimately I'm doing a PhD, which is going to be assessed on the rigor of the methods employed. It's not going to be judged on the action part of it, even if that's of personal interest to me. But my hope is definitely that the experience I'll be able to create some kind of toolkit which could be adopted perhaps even outside of this space of corporate parenting by anyone who wants to better understand another culture, or could be complementary to other social science research methods. I'm not saying you can ever replace interviews, but it could be quite often. Now we have successive or mixed approaches in the social science space. So you could be doing interviews, but you could also be taking some of the energy of the approaches that we can learn from the past.
I think the idea of using foreign theatre is really good, because often people find it. Sometimes there's ideas. I have ideas that I find and feelings that I find very hard to express in words, but to do something with other people that is externalized from yourself and that you can then reflect upon and look on, using the camera, I think it has great potential to be really powerful.
One of the just a bit of theatre techniques that I've been involved in have been amazing for the change and bringing people together and energizing. I would love to see some more of that in the Scottish government. There was a guy he couldn't make it today, unfortunately, but it's from an organisation called Active Inquiry, and they are a local foreign theatre group, and I'm hoping to work more with them in the future as well. But
You had a Plato quote.
it was a mix. It was hard to tell where it came from, because when you start digging into where the origin of quotes, there's a few different attributions to it.
Well, I'm curious about the Platonic family in all of this, and where that does that relate to what's behind the lens, that presence.
Good question. Does it? Yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that if we think about Plato's kind of conversational style with Socrates as well, isn't it? It's interesting to think of that idea of the essence of the philosophical debate about moving forward to create understanding on a subject. Yeah. Do you have an answer? Yeah. I'm not sure where I do from.
I don't know. I suppose when somebody puts the camera in front of me, I, in some ways, imagine the world looking on.
Yeah.
Like have I brushed my hair today, etc., etc. And I'm less aware of that in general because I'm just naturally scruffy. But it's like it is that, and I also any kind of capturing.
Yeah.
I do imagine. So
I think there's something quite specific about Jean-Rouge's time as well, and the people he was working with. So a lot of the people were looking at Hollywood films which were being shown in coming from these areas, so they wanted to be on screen. You go with a lot of teenagers today, the novelty factor of being filmed is long gone. But there is a lot of novelty around more of the digital media, around virtual reality, or finding ways of occupying avatars and things like that, which is of interest. But I mean, he actively celebrated the fact that the camera was altering the experience. There was no hiding the fact that people were performing, but it was in the performance, the performative you, the you don't yet know, is one of the quotes which I liked, which was this idea that through improvisation and play and in the performative mode, there was aspects of your worldview which emerged, and they became more easily accessible through fictionalizing. So you weren't playing you were playing a character. But in the fictional mode, key aspects of your worldview emerged, which I think was really fascinating. But then he was moving away from the psychotherapeutic part of it. It was never to, he would always steer it back away from that. I think in the screen back sessions, it was up to the people themselves to through seeing themselves and being represented on screen, to have a deeper understanding of themselves.
There's some really there's interesting timelines in relation to what Jean-Rouge is doing, and at the NFB as well in Canada. You have two researcher filmmakers, Saulworth and John Adair, and it's now thrown out of the water, but they were working with the Navajo, and they had this idea that how do we see ourselves and how do we see life as it's lived. And the idea that they had is that the Navajo experience life holistically differently from ourselves. And the idea was that they would, with their research, they would give cameras to the Navajo who would then show us their experience. But of course, the Navajo, they're not out with our culture. So your reaction is very culturally normative. It's the experience of how we see ourselves through the lens and how we see others on the space of the of the screen. and my own work, when I've worked in Africa with communities that have had very little in the way of technology, they're very aware of culture and the screen and the kind of telegraphing of information and how people are seen. And one of the things I always like to look for is kind of the very subtle markers of identity. So when I was working with a group of young people in Lesotho, and they're shepherds, so they're from the age of 12 to 20. They're looking after their animals, but they have a city, and they go down to the city every so often. So when they're shepherds, they wear rags, effectively, very ragged universities. So they wear blankets and Wellington boots for some reason. And, you know, they look very different. They don't look like normal teenagers do. And I was giving one of them a lift to Maseru, which is the city centre, and he went into the Ndapel and said, "I'll just go and get changed." You know, well, fair enough. He's, you know, probably going to put another pair of wellies on us, what have you. He goes in, he comes out in his streetwear, and his streetwear is just as if he walked off the street in Brixton or New York, you know, Kangol hat and slouched jeans and arse hanging out, you know, so very aware of these kind of global trends and what have you. So representations are really, it's a fascinating space, but that particular, you know, research which was happening in Canada, it's exactly the same time as Jean Rouge is in West Africa. And it's also kind of the parallel with direct cinema, and the development of direct cinema in America, with Cinema Verité, which is Jean Rouge in France. And those, the kind of parallel experiences, and you're talking about this sound off camera, it comes in later on in Jean Rouge's work. The sound in camera becomes part of it. Direct cinema is very much about sound in camera techniques. So it's...
Things you wouldn't tell from the films, because
Exactly.
they engineered the soundtrack so well, and they, that kind of post-editing was interesting.
Sorry, that was a bit...
Oh, fascinating.
It's amazing.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.